Welcome back to BadgerBlitz TV, your Rivals.com destination for all things Wisconsin athletics. Once again, I'm Matt Perkins, joined today by BadgerBlitz.com publisher John McNamara. John, great as always to see you.
Absolutely. Thanks, Matt.
Yep. It's good to be back. It's good to be back here. There is, as always, tons and tons of stuff going on in and around the Badger program. Heading into conference play this week. And I think we'll talk about the team here in just a minute. But I want to start with a couple recruiting and in-state recruiting questions for you, John. There are a couple of in-state kids who have been visiting Wisconsin and a couple other schools that are not the names that we've been accustomed to hearing so much, but a couple new guys, including Jackson McCurdy. What is the latest that you have been seeing and writing about here for in-state recruiting?
Yeah, you mentioned McCurdy, and I wrote about Emmett Bork as well.
Mm-hmm.
If you look at this 2025 in-state tight end class, I mean it's very strong, and it's obviously the state has produced some pretty good tight ends over the handful of years. Obviously Jake Ferguson comes to mind, but the headliner is obviously James Flanagan, who Wisconsin was the first school to offer him, and Notre Dame's also a pretty significant player in his recruitment. I would probably go as far as to say that the Irish probably lead for him right now, but obviously Wisconsin's still in that battle as well. McCurdy has a handful of Power 5 offers. Eli Johnson has a Division I offer. Trent Euler from Brookfield has a Division I offer. Break Theory. So you have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Kids in that 2025 class that play tight end who have Division I offers already. And then, like I said, I wrote about Emmett Bork. So, that's a position group that, I should say, a position that isn't necessarily highlighted as much, in Phil Longo's offense, and especially this year because they're down to just about 2 or 3 healthy guys there. But, if Wisconsin has to go, beyond Flanagan, and they have some really intriguing, options from, the Midwest and nationally as well. Brock Schott sticks out to me as, maybe their biggest target. Marshall Pritchard too from Georgia. So they have some guys that they're on nationally, but if they do have to go inside the state, there's some intriguing guys, and they got a handful of them on campus already. Through these first 2 weeks. I should say first 2 weeks of visits at Wisconsin.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think it's interesting that we're really starting to see more of these 2025s, and rankings will start to fill out subsequently as well. I should say the Georgia Southern game, there were a couple of interesting recruits in the house for Georgia Southern, but one of the players that I'm interested in is Eric Schmidt, the kicker out of Milwaukee. He was there once again, and Badgers being aggressive going after a kicker. Where do you think stand with Schmidt right now?
Yeah, I would imagine that Wisconsin's got to be at the top of his list. It's the only, he has a preferred walk-on offer from the Badgers. I know that was something that was, he reported that it was an offer, confirmed with him it's a preferred walk-on. It's still early for him. I wouldn't be surprised if schools come in and offer him a scholarship. You look at Cole's kicking, and he's the top-rated punter, and I think the number 4 kicker in the country. Maybe vice versa. I apologize if I'm getting that one wrong, but I think you look at this Wisconsin roster right now, and they made it a point to shore up the kicker, shore up the punter, and 2 guys who are on scholarship there. So it shows the level of importance Luke Fickell puts on special teams, and obviously Schmidt, being right in Wisconsin's backyard, has to be a top priority for them in the 2025 class. And I think he'd certainly fill a hole for you at either spot. I don't know which one that Wisconsin is targeting him to play. I thought it was kicker, actually, the last time I talked to him. But, certainly a kid that they might have to use a scholarship on if they want to keep him here at Wisconsin.
I mean, if he's that good also at both, and we've seen guys do both for schools before, and if he can do both at a high level, I think that's probably worth a scholarship.
Absolutely.
So,
yeah.
You think of a guy like Matt Araiza at San Diego State, the punt god from a couple of years ago, where he was punting and kicking and doing everything for them. A couple other interesting recruits that were on campus last weekend. To me, Griffin Rousseau returning, I think for the first time under this staff. He is a kid that I'm personally pretty high on as a kid who's a really good athlete for his size at offensive line. And then I think someone else that people are talking about a lot is Marcelo Vitti. the the athlete out of Detroit. How do you see him projecting in for the Badgers? Because there's a couple of different spots that he could potentially play.
Yeah, Wisconsin likes him at running back, and he talked about his relationship with Devin Spalding when we talked, and there's a story up on him right now. But yeah, obviously a guy that Wisconsin targeted pretty early. If you watch the film, you talk about athlete. He's a guy that kind of fits that all-purpose back, I would say, and a guy that obviously fits what Wisconsin wants to do. They've made him a pretty early priority in that class, but his recruitment is. There's a lot of schools involved. Obviously the schools in Michigan are going to be all over him. There's schools in the SEC, but he did what he said. Wisconsin is one of the schools early. Still very, very early for him that has been in contact. That's doing well in his recruitment. Has been reaching out quite a bit. So you got to try to get him on campus as many times as you can, and then see where his recruitment's at. And 12 to 18 months, he's still just a 2026 kid. But in the recently released rankings. He's a top 100 kid in that 2026 class.
Yeah. And so speaking of, that, 2026, 2025, some other in-state kids, Kevin Wojciechowski was also there recently. And he's a kid, I think, who has a pretty good frame if he's going to be playing sort of the defensive end position for Wisconsin. He's not the only Oak Creek kid who was here last weekend. I know his teammate, James Thomas, who's also another big guy, probably projects on the offensive line. We haven't seen a ton of scholarships out of Oak Creek in a minute, but do you think that either of these two guys could, be potential scholarship kids down the line?
Yeah, I absolutely do. I don't know. I can't say for sure it's going to happen at Wisconsin, but I lived with when I was attending school at Wisconsin, one of the coaches on Oak Creek's coaching staff right now, and he kind of gives you names to keep an eye on and stuff. And he's like, look, this Wojciechowski kid is just starting to figure out how to move at that size and start to play football at that size. And he thinks, the sky's the, I mean, that whole staff thinks the sky's the limit for that kid. And, he's legit 6'6", 250 pounds, and, visited Minnesota to start things off, visited Wisconsin. And then I'll give you a little behind the scenes. I texted my buddy. I was like, dude, you need to tell this kid to get his huddle tape out, because I was writing a story and I couldn't find his huddle anywhere. He's like, all right, I'll tell him during the day. So the huddle came out about 24 hours ago. I'd imagine schools are going to pick up on that. And he seems kind of like a no doubt Division I guy. Again, I can't say what level it's going to be. I can't say Wisconsin's going to offer the kid, but I certainly think he's going to pop up on campus a handful more times. I'm sure Wisconsin would like to probably see him camp. I think he's going to definitely be a guy that's on the radar. And then, down in that 2026 class is, Thomas, like you talked about. And if you talked about Wojciechowski's just kind of figuring things out, he's just kind of a baby too as well there. Big kid, offensive tackle for them who's, certainly if he projects the way that I think a lot of people think he can project and trend, that, he'll certainly be in the Division I offer conversation sooner rather than later, I would say.
All right, so moving from 2026 to 2024, the Badgers have thrown out a couple defensive line offers out recently. Lugard Idokpayi, gosh, I don't know if I'm probably completely botching that. From Maryland, and Jayshon Ross out of Kansas City. I think that defensive line has been sort of a position where Badger fans especially have been critical of this first sort of full recruiting class and the lack of star talent on the defensive line. Do you see things picking up with either of these guys or any other defensive linemen for 2024?
Yeah, I would imagine that they have now identified that as, hey, we got to go get another guy. So if it's not one of the two that you talked about, Matt, I would imagine it'll be someone. And, I was able to connect with Ross, and he's looking at potentially getting there to Wisconsin for a visit this fall, but nothing's set there just yet. So if one of these two guys pops up on campus, and I would imagine they'll get them there for an official, then I think things kind of ramp up. But with the offers there to two defensive ends, to me it says we're going to try to add another defensive end in this class. They're not going to force anything. They have two commits. Hank Weber, Dylan Johnson. But I think you look at, the state of the position and, the available scholarships. I think maybe they said, hey, we got to attack and get a guy who makes sense for us at defensive end to potentially add to this class.
Yeah, I think that's probably the one major position that they're going to need to address in this cycle. Otherwise, if we go through your your monthly state of the class, it's typically pretty much shorn up everywhere else that they are looking. But let's talk about the team that we're seeing on the field right now as the Badgers head into Big Ten play on a Friday night. Always, a Friday night game is not. Friday Night Lights should be for high school. That's just me, though. But
I agree.
Friday night in West Lafayette, the Badgers are taking on Purdue, and there have been some questions we've been getting in the Badgers Den. Shout out to Mama Badger, who wants us to address sort of the Jack Nelson and the offensive line in general. I think it's pretty much consensus around anyone who's been watching the program that the line has struggled so far adapting to the new scheme in a lot of ways. We've seen, especially in that Washington State game, a lot of pressures and sacks and turnovers that are because there's been a lot of pressure. Have you heard anything about sort of the state of the line, how guys are feeling, and if there's anything that's going to majorly happen? I think on the field that the one thing that we saw this past week is a lot more Trey Wettig on the field. And I know that Coach Fick alluded to Renfro potentially being available, but what's the latest on the offensive line?
Yeah, I think you talked about the two biggest things is Renfro potentially being available. I don't know. I guess if I were to guess, it's going to take the bye week for him to be there. I don't know anything concrete, but if I were to guess, he doesn't play against Purdue, but then, you talk about getting the bye in an additional week, and then maybe he's ready to go. You mentioned Trey Wettig, and if you look at the snap count, he took more snaps than Huber and Furtney. So, that's kind of a telling sign there. If you do get Renfro back, would Wettig give you reps at tackle potentially? I think they like him at guard. So, they mentioned, I think Luke Fickell mentioned on Monday, they feel good about 6 linemen. And it's 7 probably then when Renfro comes back. So, the people that are knocking on the door for Nolan Rucci, I don't see that happening this year if things stay relatively the same. I don't know if they're comfortable putting him in a game. And I think that with as much as Jack Nelson struggled against Washington State, he still played every rep, and he played every rep the following week until they brought guys in, I think, for just a series at the end there with Braden Locke. So I don't see these wholesale changes being made because I don't think they feel good about. I mean, maybe that's not the right wording to say don't feel good about, but they feel like the guys that they're playing right now give them the best chance to win. And I don't see a whole lot changing on the offensive line other than getting Renfro back, which I think you're putting a projected starter there at center.
Yeah, maybe don't have the same amount of confidence in as we can.
Thank you.
Is the way that we can put it. Yeah, I'm sort of fascinated by the machinations of the offensive line on a yearly basis. In general, it's my favorite position to watch, and I think that it's pretty fair to say that since 2021, really, the Badgers' offensive line has not been up to the standard that has been set in the past 30 years. We've seen, a lot of struggles both on the ground and especially in pass protection. And in my opinion, that's what led to a fair few of Graham Mertz's problems behind center was that he got the yips in terms of he had to rush his clock in his head so much that, when he did have time, he wasn't used to it. And so I think that this is an issue, especially, I'm going to give them a little bit of a pass as it's a completely new system. They're pass setting differently. They're run blocking, like everything is done in a very different manner than they have been trained. That being said, it is still going to be an issue moving forward, especially into Big Ten play when we're going to see more and more excellent defensive linemen as the Purdue Boilermaker Express goes by my house. They're
My
gearing
goodness.
up. Yanni Karloftis is gearing up to go after Wisconsin, the team. I actually thought it was really interesting reading, John, the recruiting redux of Purdue versus Wisconsin, because for some reason in my head, I had thought that there were going to be more mutual targets on that ended up at Purdue.
Yeah. Yeah, and it was really, we do these every year, and I think they're a fun kind of look back. It's interesting to go back and say, oh yeah, that guy, oh yeah, that guy. With Purdue, it hasn't been as many, and it's kind of both ways. They didn't have as many common targets as maybe you would expect for two teams in the same conference, two teams that are
Same division.
states, right? Yeah, no, right. So it was really like you mentioned, Carl Aftis, who. Look, he mentioned Wisconsin, and I think Wisconsin was a legit player for him. But obviously, with his connection to the school, with his brother going there, that kind of always seemed where he would go. And then from the flip side, Jordan Turner, I didn't know it until I talked to his coach. I mean, this was years ago when he committed. He's like, yeah, mom kind of decided it. Mom went to Wisconsin, dad went to Purdue, and I've done this for a long time. If you can get mom on board, 99 times out of 100, you can get the kid at your school. So I thought that was an interesting one. Obviously, Jordan Turner has done some pretty good stuff at Wisconsin. We'll be starting on Friday. So as the season wears on, I think they'll get a little bit more interesting and more in detail and stuff like that. So Wisconsin, Iowa, they got tons of kids. That were kind of common recruiting targets. And as we go on in that series, I think people will maybe enjoy the read a little bit more, because this one was kind of brief, because there wasn't that many head-to-head true recruiting battles between these two schools.
Yeah. So nonetheless, I'm excited for the game. My neighbor actually is a Boilermaker, so we're going to watch the game together. He's been pretty underwhelmed by Ryan Walters' first season so far. So according to him, they don't have any defense. So I'm hoping he's right. I'm hoping Wisconsin's offense gets off the ground a little bit more, even though they scored 35 against Georgia Southern. I still think that there was, something left to be desired from an execution standpoint.
A lot of meat left on the bone.
Definitely a lot of meat left on the bone. Well, there's always meat left on the bone for us, John, which is good, because that means we can just come back and talk more. I'll be back later this week again with Clint talking more recruiting. John and I will be back again next week. And everyone, thank you for tuning in. Make sure you're over on BadgerBlitz.com all the time, the best site for Wisconsin sports information anywhere in the known universe. Until next time, he's John McNamara. I'm Matt Perkins. And so long, and we'll see you in the den.